Welcome to the Empowered Living Zone, where you can create the life you crave. With me, Dr. A, as a psychologist for over 30 years, a transformational life coach, and an expert in self-empowerment, my life's work has been inspired by the beautifully powerful resilience of the human spirit. We will share stories and successes of people who have not only overcome personal adversity, but have used their traumas and hardships courageously as a springboard into greatness. Create positive transformational shifts on your way to achieving phenomenal success. Get ready to level up as you move beyond the challenging terrain of your life's journey into the empowered living zone. Ignited by spirit, fueled by purpose, and guided by vision, the Empowered Living Zone show starts now.
Hey everyone, I'm Dr. Pat, and as you know, I have been taking this journey with, yes, Dr. A. Today's show is in response to a number of requests we've gotten where people want to know, how did you get there? And we're getting questions like this. We're getting them on social media, and people are listening to the shows and they're just in awe about what we're talking about. But what they really want to know is, how does someone get to the place where you can say you are A, B, C, or D? And that's what today's show is about, the Empowered Living Zone, the person and the story behind the concept. Now, for many of you, you've heard me do this show with Dr. A. You've heard us talk about some amazing things. But the question is, how does one get there? And so part of this today is to share that you get there, one, by all the principles Dr. Hayes talked about on previous shows, but there's more to the story. There's the personal side of the story. There's the story that says, oh, do you keep going? Because when you think about this and you think about who Dr. A is, this is a life work that's been inspired by the powerful resilience of the human spirit, as she would say it. This has been about having a heart in the right place, but then taking action. It's about stories of courage, about hope. Her early life story of hardship, which you'll hear about today, how that fueled her passion to help and support others. And, what's underneath it all, for those of us that have had a few roadblocks, well, we know what it's like to feel the pain of woundedness. We also know what it's like to be victorious over that pain. And so many of you out there, we know that that's what you're going through. So today you're going to hear a story. How do you get from that place in life? How do you then go on to school, a bachelor's degree with honors, a master's degree, a doctorate degree? How do you go on and do that? What is it about that? But more importantly, like you heard in the introduction, how do you build up 30 years of becoming an expert in the field, so that when you put your seal of approval on self-empowerment and you're called an expert transformational coach and the queen of self-empowerment and self-leadership, what is underneath all of that? Because I said on an earlier show today with someone, you can look at all the credentials, all the awards that any of us have gotten, but that is not what has pushed us up the ladder. It has been our life experiences. It has been what we've learned from them, so that when you work with us, we can recognize it almost immediately. Dr. A, are you ready to have some greatness today in a conversation that so many people want to hear about? Yes, people have been encouraged by what we've been talking about. But underneath this comes something we don't talk about. And that is our life experiences, which surround all of the credentials, don't you think?
Absolutely, Dr. Pat. I mean, it is interesting because, you hit the nail on the head. When I think about who I am and how I've landed here, my training and my credentials are not important. Those aren't the things that really stand out. Now, don't get me wrong, those are important. I'm not just anybody hanging a shingle out and saying I'm a self-empowerment queen. I clearly have lots of experience and lots of training. And so I don't want to minimize those or diminish those and diminish those achievements. Yet, as I say that, Dr. Pat, when I think about, and it's funny, as I was thinking about coming on today and talking about myself. I will be absolutely honest. This is probably the hardest podcast that I may do. And I think part of it is I think a lot of us are uncomfortable with having light shown on us. And also, I think what's challenging about this is, how do I communicate this as succinctly as I possibly can? Because quite frankly, there's nothing succinct about life experience. I think about, like, if somebody were to say, when I'm thinking about aspiring at 15 or 18, what do I want to do with my life? If somebody would have said, Charleanea, down the road, you're going to be on a podcast about self-empowerment and you are going to be an expert in self-empowerment, I would have looked at them like they had a third eye. I would have never imagined in a million years. And now I look back at it and it's interesting. I was thinking about this the other day. For those of us who know Steve Jobs, and I know that he passed, in 2005, he gave a commencement speech to Stanford graduates. And for whatever reason, it's interesting, that is almost 20 years ago. I was really drawn to this. So this is 20 years ago. I was really drawn to his speech. And one of the things that he talked about was connecting the dots. And he talked about, you connect the dots backwards. You don't connect the dots going forward. And that really resonated for me, because I think about my own journey and how I landed here. Something in me, it's my heart. It was my intuition. It just kept pulling me through to things, that I pursued, that I was interested. I think about my own healing process. And, at that moment, I'm not thinking about, oh, I'm taking these stepping stones to get to my place of self-empowerment. No, something is pulling me in this direction, and I'm being pulled in this direction. Part of it, quite frankly, was motivated by my own desire and quite frankly, a desperate desire to be happy, to be fulfilled. And so I look at this, and now I look back at my experience and I'm like, wow, this makes perfect sense. This makes absolute sense. I look backwards and it's like, oh, these are how all these dots are connected. I came into the world, and I've mentioned this in previous podcasts, my personal story. I came into the world, and it was a very impoverished environment. And there weren't adults around. There wasn't guidance, there wasn't love, there wasn't nurturing. And so I relied on what was inside of me. And when I say what's inside of me, it's not me, Charleanea, it's this divinity, it's this higher being. And it kept me company, it guided me. It also resulted in my developing this very, very deep self-awareness. And self-awareness, as I had mentioned before, is absolutely critical. It's the most important part of this journey, is having that self-awareness. So I have that. And then I go through my own life experiences of trauma. As I'd mentioned, there was physical abuse in my household. There was emotional abuse. There was sexual abuse. There was neglect. I had all this trauma. And I really didn't even realize I had trauma until I was in my 30s. And I was experiencing the woundedness from that. And when I say the woundedness, what exactly did that mean? It meant that I had severe anxiety. The world didn't feel safe to me. It meant that I had this emptiness, this loneliness, this hole inside of me. It meant that I had feelings that I wasn't worthy, that I wasn't good enough. I wasn't good enough to be nurtured. I wasn't good enough to be loved. And this is the thing that pulled me through my journey and put me on this path of searching. And it's what got me into my spirituality. It's what got me into places of how do I make this different for myself? And these are the stepping stones that took me to the place of empowerment. I wasn't looking for empowerment. I was looking for relief. I was looking for, I want to be able to have a different experience. And this is what led me to self-empowerment.
And we're going to talk about this more, because I'm so glad you mentioned Stanford. Your story is compelling. It's compelling. And believe it or not, the more you and I can talk about this, and thank you for your courage of sharing this today, because I'm not kidding when I say our experiences are in the center. our credentials, our awards, our certificates, I don't know, whatever all that is, right? That's around the outside. But together, those are what make the story that you're telling so valuable. But even more importantly, it's what makes you that person that people want to call to learn what the Empowered Living Zone is about. Yes, sometimes we have to have credentials, but it's something else. You know what I'm struck by? And we'll talk about this more when we come back from break. I've talked now on a couple of shows, and some of the people I've been on shows with, they didn't even know what I'm talking about. But I sat there in awe last night for the women's basketball draft. And I sat there in awe. And yes, I heard from the announcers, but they didn't really talk about the magnitude of these women being in the Empowered Living Zone and how contagious it has become. So contagious that they sold tickets for the draft for the first time in history, that a lot of the games are sold out. Oh, someone called me on the phone and said, "Did you go get your Storm tickets yet?" And I'm like, okay. They said, "You're not going to get any." Why? Because these women sharing what you shared, taking the steps that we're about to talk about now, are now showing the world what is possible despite overcoming challenges. And you mentioned Stanford. I got to give a little shout out to Cameron Brink. Thank you, Cameron, for taking that #2 pick. And it was okay to cry. Let's take a short break. When we come back, you're going to hear more from Dr. A about how do you know you're empowered? Why did I just mention these women? How do you know you're empowered? Is it when you get there? Do you know, like during the journey? Do you know when everything in the bottom falls out? Do you still know you're empowered? I don't know the answers to that. Dr. A is going to share that. Let's take a short break. We'll be right back. Hey, everyone, you are listening to the Empowered Living Zone with me, Dr. Pat. But today's show, the reason I'm at the helm for a moment is because I've asked Dr. A, and we've talked about this. There's something to be said in the stories that we tell, the personal stories that go beyond what you see at the end of our names, what you see in front of it. And those stories are compelling. They talk to the point of why I do what I do, why Dr. A does what Dr. A does, and how the Empowered Living Zone was formed and created. What we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about not just how you get here, but we're going to talk about how do you know that you're in this place? How do you know? Can you feel where something has changed, where you're not feeling what, like a victim anymore? Even if you have a major knee injury, are you still feeling like you're at the top? How do you know? Dr. A, for you, thank you for sharing that story. There's so many, I'm going to make a statement. There's so many, because you know this, you and I are both in the field of psychology. We know the level of abuse that is going on in the households, but we rarely hear the stories about it. And thank you for sharing that. Because I had to build a level of resilience in you. But here's the question. When did you know? Like, when did you know that you were experiencing something that wasn't that what you shared, but something different, something you call empowered? When did you know that? What did that feel like?
That's a great question, Dr. Pat. And I think the answer, this is going to sound like a contradiction and a paradox. The answer is, on some level it changed as I aged and as I developed, and yet at the same time it was the same thing. And I know that sounds like a paradox, and I'll explain what I mean by that. When I think about the very first time that I had some conscious awareness of something in me, this power, this power of rising above what was happening in front of me. The youngest I was when I experienced that was 4. And you have to remember, this is through a 4-year-old mind. Now, what's interesting is when I go back and look at it, the experience is the same. The understanding or the integration of that experience changes as we get older and more knowledgeable and have life experience. And so what was it at the age of 4? I remember, and this happened multiple times, I remember being in my family and there'd be something going on. And I would just sit and I'd actually be standing and I would be staring at these people in my lives, my caretakers, my siblings, my aunts and uncles. And I would have this experience like, what are you guys doing? Like I was puzzled because it was like, don't you know? Like, how could you not know? And I could experience the difference between their experience of the world, and their experience of the world, quite frankly, was very sad. There was a sense of helplessness. There was a sense of resignation. There was a sense of, keep your head down, and just move through life. There was this emptiness, like they weren't alive. And when I would look at them and I would go, what are you doing? How can you not know this? My internal experience was I was deeply connected to the greater whole. And I felt that. I felt it in so many levels. I felt it like everything is okay. You are taken care of. You are okay. There's a sense of well-being. There was a sense of flow, just knowing. It was the best way that I could describe it was a trust. The trust was, I'm okay. I am taken care of. There are great things waiting for me. And there was a sense of excitement and feeling alive. And I was really struck by how different how different my internal experience was from my experience in my family. Now, I'm not going to lie to you, Dr. Pat. It's not like this connection is 100% 24/7, decades of my life. There were times when I would lose that connection. I would lose the connection with that internal power. And yet I would be reminded over and over and over again. Because I think what happens is, and this is part of the journey, part of being a human is forgetting and remembering. And as you remember each time, the power is even that much more powerful. And I'll say, as I got older, I had experiences that were like, oh yeah, I remember this. I think if I were to give you one experience in particular where I felt like it was a consistent experience of that empowered state, I would say it was when I was a mother. And it was from the moment, and this is going to sound a little crazy and woohoo, from the moment I knew I was pregnant. I knew I was pregnant. And from that moment on, through my whole pregnancy and through my whole experience as a mother, I was deeply connected to that power within. And there's a sense of flow. There's a sense of well-being. There's a sense of everything's good. Everything's taken care of. There's nothing for me to worry about. All I need to do is show up and be who I am, and it's going to be fine.
That experience you just described, I mean, I'm feeling the energy from the people that are listening, because they know what you're talking about. They know. And I think each and every one of us has a moment like that. Maybe that's not it for you listening, but I'll tell you, you had a moment. For me, it was the first time I couldn't stand to be at my aunt's house after my mom took a turn for the worst. And I decided to live on the fire escape in Manhattan in their apartment. And that what you have that moment, find that moment that Dr. A just talked about. Find that moment. You have it in you, because those are the moments that you want to hold on to, right, Dr. A? Those are the moments you want to hang on to when things maybe not going so great. I had a flashback about that moment this morning. Me as a 6-year-old on a fire escape in Manhattan, right? They got tall buildings there. I think it was on the east side. I can't remember, but it was by the water, and the fire escape, you could look at the river. And I remember and I got a lot of grief from it. I mean, there was one point they had to call the cops to try to get me back in. And of course that didn't work. But you see, these are the moments that I think you're encouraging people to hold on to, aren't you?
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, something that, and it's interesting having this conversation, Dr. Pat, because you know, I will tell you, I'm a talker, and when it's hard for me to say I'm at a loss for words. These experiences sometimes are really difficult to convey with words. Words don't do it justice. I'm not doing it justice by trying to explain in words the experience. Yet when you're there, you know you are there. And I think what's important about this is, you know, again, we've had conversations about this. You know, people look outside of themselves for the answers. You know, they look outside of themselves for the truth. You know, they look outside of themselves for direction. And the crazy thing is, it's all in us. It's there. You know, it makes me think, you know, and I've said this before, I'm the queen of metaphors. It makes me think of the acorn. You know, people have talked about the acorn. What's the acorn? The acorn already knows it's an oak tree, right? It already knows, even though it's this little acorn, it already acts as if it's an oak tree. And in some ways, we're not any different. It is already in us. The acorn, our acorn is in there. And whoever we are to become, wherever we are to be, wherever direction we are to be drawn to trust that, because it is our own intelligence finding its expression and pulling us to the thing or the experience that's necessary for us to evolve.
Yeah. You know, look, there have been times where I don't know about you, but let me just say this. I'm going to use an expression. And I grew up with uncles that were in the boxing, you know, like boxing, that sport. I grew up with uncles. I got my first pair of boxing gloves when I was age 5. So that just tells you a little bit. But there have been moments, to use an expression, where I felt like throwing in the towel. Now, I never really did it because, like you, I've had some other influences. But I wanted to ask you, there have been moments where you must have asked yourself, how am I going to keep going in life? What am I going to do? You know, have you ever felt those moments where you just think, I don't know that I can go on? Have you ever felt like,
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. Yeah.
I want to talk about those when we come back from break, because in those moments, you and I have had a lifetime of where we've had influences from others. Even in those moments, there have been people, even if we read a book, you mentioned Steve Jobs, even if it was somebody that came across our desk or somebody, I joke about the fact that it's in the 80s and early 90s, and people starting to hand me these books that I just looked at them like, I am not reading that book by Victor, whoever his name is. I mean, like, what is he? Is it Frankenstein? No, it was Viktor Frankl. And I'm just like, oh, seriously? I don't have time to read that. I'm too busy. What? Uh, drinking or using, or what are you too busy with? Building a career that you're going to get fired from eventually. So when we come back, I want to talk about those moments in your life, the things that have kept you going. Because you and I are not sitting here because we got a silver spoon or because we are on the water slide at some amusement park. Hello. The only water slide I can think of I've been on is one that you get on at the end. There's no water. So let's take a short break. When we come back, more with Dr. A and more with, what do you want to create? See, what do you want to create? What is that? Don't say no. Don't be afraid. Just watch the movie Dune, and Dune will tell you fear is the little mind killer. When we come back, what do you want to create? What can you do to get help creating it from Dr. A? We're going to tell you how to do that, how to get in touch with her, how to talk about the empowered living zone. But when we come back, I'm curious to know how she picks herself up when she's all grimy and dirty from a life experience. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Empowered Living Zone. And I want to say Dr. A and I are just switching roles for today because I wanted Dr. A to share a story. And the reason that this is so important is because so many of you have had a rough time of it here. And I got an email that kind of asked the question, have you always been that positive? Have you always been like you are? And what I realized is that each of us that do this, we go through life. Dr. A is such a person. Now, before we continue with how do you pick yourself up, especially when you've been knocked down, um, how do people find out more about you? How can they work with you, Dr. A? What is the best way for people to reach out to you?
Yes, I mean, if you know, listeners, if there's some listeners out there that are interested in doing this work with me, or they're just interested in what I call spiritual transformational life coaching or empowered living, they are welcome to contact me through my website at www.empoweredlivingcoaching.com. Again, that's www.empoweredlivingcoaching.com. You can go to the contact page, hit the button, fill out your information, and I will respond to any inquiries.
So I have alluded to a couple of things today that maybe some of the listeners are not familiar with, but if you're not, just try to Google this. There's been a shift in women's sports again. You know, there have been many shifts. We've watched it in tennis, right? We've watched it happen over time. We've watched it in soccer. We've watched women's soccer elevate itself to the point where, hello, what do you mean we didn't win the Olympic gold, right? We've seen men and women both achieve great things. You see it, you hear it. We also know when they don't. Steve Jobs, you mentioned Steve Jobs, and let's start with that because Steve Jobs, nobody ever thought Steve Jobs would be dethroned, but he didn't stop, did he? Steve Jobs did not stop. Neither did you. So let's talk about what it takes to dust ourselves off, rise up, and maybe sometimes recreate, reinvent, and redesign our life way. How did you do it?
Dr. Pat, I think it's really important before we get to the how to also to talk about, I think this is really important. A lot of times, you know, people misunderstand or they make assumptions. There's these implicit biases that people make about individuals. And, something that I think is really important is, I got to this place because of pain. I got to this place because I was struggling. And one of the questions you asked right before we had taken a break is, have you ever been in those places where you didn't think you could keep going? And I said, absolutely. And I want the listeners to hear this because I want the listeners to understand that I'm not any different than anybody else out in the world. I have my highs and I have my lows. And I had some particularly rough times in my life. And I will tell you, my first time was at about 15, and I was actually suicidal. I was ready to do it. I was ready to do the deed. I had a plan, and, I was getting in the truck, and something in me told me to go to somebody's house instead. And that's what I did. And that's the thing that saved me that night. And I had several of those in my life, especially, I had a situation where I couldn't have hit any further than rock bottom. I grew up, I had a teenage mother, a teenage father, and my mother dropped out of high school. And I watched my mother struggle. She worked at minimum wage jobs. She worked at Burger King. We couldn't make a living. We were hungry. And I always told myself, I will never be like her. I will never be like her, meaning with children, no job, and unable to take care of myself. And here's the irony about this, Dr. Pat. When I was 34 years old and I had my son, my partner literally walked out of the door and left me alone with my child. And within the same week, I got a call that I did not have a job. Isn't it interesting how God works? It's like, okay, we're going to have you experience this and heal from this. So I was without a job, without a partner, on my own, and with a child. And that was probably the most bottom of my bottoms. And I can remember being in my closet because I didn't want to hear I didn't want my infant son to hear me crying, and just in a ball, like, I can't do this. I can't do this. And here's the crazy part about this, Pat. No matter how low I have been, there has always been something in me that's separate from that voice that says, you can do it. You can keep going. Come on, you can do it. Get up, dust yourself off. Here's something for you. And the something for you, I'll be really transparent about my journey. Dr. Pat, nobody saved me. Nobody knocked at the door and said, hey, here I am, Superman. I'm going to take you out of this. I had to figure it out on my own. And what did I do? I went to books. It's funny that you talked about what the hell do I do with this? That's where I went, because here's the other crazy part about this, Dr. Pat, was this was a silence suffering. It was a silent suffering. Nobody knew what was happening inside. On the outside, I looked great. I looked like I had my shit together. Inside, I was a mess. And I started searching. And I started reading, and I read spiritual texts. I read self-help books. I read all kinds of stuff. And these are the things that brought me some hope. And they also brought me tools. They helped me look at things differently and pull me out of those dark places. And so, when I think about that, going to your question about how do you do this?
Yeah.
There's no magic.
Yeah.
There's not a magic pill. There's not a savior. What happened for me is I listened to that voice that was really deep in me. And it guided me. It would guide me to places. And, I do believe in the idea, or I believe in the experience of God, and my concept of God really comes from what I would call the New Thought movement. The New Thought movement presented itself like in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And basically the idea of the New Thought movement was God was not outside of us. We were not separate up from God. We were God. God was in us, and that there was a divine plan, and that we were part of that plan. And that was really important to me. It gave me hope. It gave me direction. And what I realized when I stumbled onto this, I started paying attention, and I started to see all of the ways in which the universe supported me. Like the perfect book would show up that I needed to read, and it would help me with those answers. It would help me with the healing and the healing process. And so how did I get myself out of this? When I was in those deep, dark places of just deep despair, I would get what I needed. I would hear something on the radio. Somebody would say something to me. I always got that little piece that I needed to pull me out of those things. And then it would give me the strength to keep going. And I would keep pursuing whatever that little piece was. And before I know it, there would be a shift in me. There would be hope. I would get reconnected with that sense of well-being in myself.
It's interesting you brought that up, because I grew up in a very interesting spiritual religious family. I think I've talked about this, where grow up Catholic, but then here comes stepmom, Southern Baptist, but she had a very different view. And what's fascinating are the things I remember from her tutelage, from her teaching. And here's what I remembered until I too found a different spiritual path. But I'm a spiritual hitchhiker, so I spent a lot of years really checking them all out. But one of the things I take away, even from my mom's Christianity teaching, and she would say this: there are things in almost everything you find where you'll find the words, "The kingdom of God is within you. Greater than these you shall do." But what they're talking about, what you're talking about, is this ability to understand that power that's within us. It's that ability to know, and that's really what you're referencing to in the empowered living zone, because what you work with is also a spiritual component. I mean, you just talked about your coaching platform. You talked about what you do with that. See, there is that guidance system that if each and every one of us could recognize it, that guidance system within, that thing that says you got something inside of you that can get you to a Steve Jobs moment, a Caitlin Clark moment, I mean, whatever that is inside of you that gets you to that moment. I'm going to digress for a minute, because I want to ask you about this. I don't remember the year, but there was a turning point in Hollywood. It was not too long ago. We had moments of this, what was it, 70s maybe? But it came back for young girls. And it came back in the form of, no, I'm not going to say Barbie, but it did come back for Barbie. It came back in the form of Wonder Woman, right? And we're not going to spend the whole show talking about this, but I want to ask you about this, because for a lot of young girls that were young at the time, Gal Gadot put on the Wonder Woman suit and literally took a movie that would have been a flop, the Justice League, and made it a hit, things changed. They found something, right? And the reason I'm bringing it up is each of us have been influenced by different people. Now, clearly, there are a generation of young girls. For boys too, there are things that they look up to. Some people look at intellect. They look at the smart people. They look at the Einsteins. They look at those people. Clearly, Oppenheimer became a box office hit. Why? Most people didn't even care about World War II, but they tapped into that. But we get influenced by people. Were you influenced by people? And can you share who they were?
Yes, absolutely. We can talk about that when we come back from break, but absolutely.
All right, let's take a really, really short break, Emily. And when we come back, think about the people that have tapped your shoulder. They don't have to be here now, but I mentioned my stepmom teaching us things from the Bible, not the way you would hear them. Everything out of my mom's mouth about those scriptures, she was like a mini me, Joel Osteen. Everything to the point where we never actually used that book. But my mom, for some reason, first child at 12, second child at 13, she had a different view of life. When we come back, we're going to see who touched the heart of Dr. A. We'll be right back. Hey everyone, welcome back. I want to just remind you, you are listening to the Empowered Living Zone with Dr. A. You are meant for more. Now, I want to say our roles are switched here for today because we wanted you to hear a couple of messages. It doesn't matter where you are in life or what you're going through at the moment. We wanted you to hear messages of inspiration, hope, and positive action. And out of this, Dr. A has created a phenomenal practice, coaching and beyond. Can you just, before we get your secret influencers, tell folks how they can work with you?
Absolutely, Dr. Pat. If you'd like to inquire about the opportunity to work with me personally, or you'd like to hear more about psychospiritual transformational life coaching or the empowered living zone, you are welcome to reach me through my website, which is www.empoweredlivingcoaching.com. Again, www.empoweredlivingcoaching.com. You can go to the contact page and fill out the information and send that to me, and I will respond as soon as I possibly can.
Awesome. All right.
So the
You've
secret
been,
sauce.
I'm telling you, I've had people influence me and you have. I'd love to know who
Oh,
influenced you. And what I mean by that is either touched you personally, either worked with, either read about, doesn't matter. But what are those folks that became role model like for you?
absolutely. And what I'll do, Dr. Pat, I'll start with people that were in my life that really influenced me. I would say it started with my paternal grandmother. She was a Latin woman, very, very, very proud woman. And, she grew up at a time, and quite frankly, I did as well. I grew up at a time where there was racism and there was prejudice. And no matter what, my grandmother, and, my grandmother's first language was Spanish. And she just had this powerful presence to her. And, oh, I just admired her. And I remember her saying, there's a saying in Spanish, it's que sera, sera. And basically what that means is what will be, will be. And my grandmother had this wisdom about her. It's like, what will be. And we will keep our head up high and we will move through it and it'll be okay. And she had a lot of influence on me. And then I had a maternal great grandmother that I absolutely adored. I didn't get to spend much time with her because she lived in another state. But what I loved about her was that she was just love embodied. I had never met a person in my life where I could just be with her and I could feel that love. And it was amazing. I craved it. And so in terms of, personal heroes, I would say that. And also, again, listeners don't know my entire story and the details. I had a high school teacher rescue me at 15. So when I shared the experience that I had when I was suicidal, this teacher actually saved me. She was my angel incarnate, as I said, and she is still in my life today. And she had a big influence on me. Now, these are people in my life and have been in my life. When I zoom out a little bit and I look at who influenced me and influenced the way that I think about things or what I do or how I show up, I would say that there's kind of two pieces to this. One of them is the spiritual piece. I have always been drawn to spirituality. I just knew intuitively that the answers were there for me. And my first, I did reject traditional religion. I grew up in a very traditional Latino Catholic household. And the concept of God did not make sense to me. Yet I didn't have any other experiences of God other than my own personal. And I happened to, in my 20s, I happened to stumble on a series of texts, books written by Neil Donald Walsh, Conversations with God. And that opened up my door. It was like, this is it. This is it. And he described God from the perspective that I said earlier, is that God is in us. It's in us, and it's not outside of us. And it really opened up my eyes to what was possible. And a lot of my healing came from spiritual texts. I was very much influenced, like I said before, by the New Thought movement. So I read a lot of Ernest Holmes, for example. I read a lot of William James, Varieties of Religious Experiences. And then other people, that are probably well known now, Thich Nhat Hanh, Pema Chodron. She read a wonderful book that really resonated with me, and it was called The Places That Scare You. And Mark Nepo, I think my favorite spiritual book is by Mark Nepo, the Book of Awakening. That definitely changed my life. When I look at it from more of a secular perspective, or kind of the human growth healing perspective, I would say that a person that's probably had the single most influence on me is Byron Katie. She wrote a wonderful book called Loving What Is. And it's interesting because it's in the same spirit as my grandmother's Que Sera, Sera, loving what is, not fighting what is not fighting what is right in front of you, not fighting your experience, and trusting that whatever's presented to you is for you. And so, Byron Katie was a big influence on me, as well as Debbie Ford. She wrote a great book called The Dark Side of the Light Chasers. And Colin Tipping wrote a great book called Radical Forgiveness. And it's interesting, I want to share this with you as well, Dr. Pat, that particularly with Byron Katie, Wayne Dyer actually has the similar story, as well as Neil Donald Walsh. One of the things that really resonated for me with each of these people is every one of them came from the bottom. They wrote these books that are so influential in my life after being at their rock bottom, after it being at that place where they were just about to give up. And I find that very magical, because I feel like I've had tastes of that, or pieces of that. Those moments when I'm just about ready to give up, I had this really strong flare of inspiration. It's like fire. And I suspect it's true for these individuals, Byron Katie, Neil Donald Walsh, and Wayne Dyer, for that matter, as well as Debbie Ford. They all describe this darkness, this deep darkness, and out of this darkness comes this light and inspiration. And those stories really resonated with me as well. And it probably had a lot to do why I was drawn to their stories and what they had to say.
Those people that you mentioned, and for those of you that are watching the show, please pause this and go back and look them up, because we're talking about people that changed the landscape and moved from spiritual text into action driven by spirit. And that's what they all have in common. And there are others, of course. But these are folks that when you start on this journey and you happen to come across, or somebody hands you a book, or you happen to listen to a show like this, you think, what did she say? Neil Donald who? Yeah, Neil Donald Walsh, Wayne Dyer. many, many others, Deepak Chopra. There's so many, and there are some that were influential even outside of this. But what you're saying is, I hear you saying three things. One, boy, these folks were put in front of you. Two, you decided to do something about them, either read their book, studied with them, gone to conferences, whatever that was. And then three, you had to make a conscious decision to change yourself. See, I have read a lot of books. We're joking right now because this is our 20th year and they're trying to count how many books I've read and how many shows I've done. And I'm leaving that up to other people because that's fascinating to my team. But to me, nothing is greater than what we learn from them. And I think what you're saying, these folks have been pivotal in helping shape the Dr. A that we're looking at now. Is that right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And there's one thing that I want to end with today that I think is really important. I think it's reflective in their stories, and I will say that it's reflective in my story as well. And I think this is something, looking back, it all makes sense. And that is, we actually heal others from our own woundedness. That is what is so beautiful about this, is that our ego gets in the way, and we judge our woundedness. We judge it as there's something wrong with us. We're broken. We can't contribute anything because we're broken. And in reality, it's these broken places that our brilliance come from. So it's our woundedness, so when I think about my own experience, I am going to say this, and I'm going to own this. I believe that I am a phenomenal therapist. I'm a phenomenal life coach because I get it. And I actually help others from my own wounded place. And that is where the magic happens.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm so glad you said that, because that is why we're doing the show. You and I have both of that in common. Yes, there are other things we can talk about what we've learned and how we've learned them. But I don't know about you. When I went on for my doctorate, I studied something, and that something I studied was a serious point of woundedness in my life. My dad broke every promise he ever made to me, my mom, my stepmom, and my stepsisters. So it wasn't a mistake that I studied the consequences of broken promises for 10 years. I'm not telling people to do that, but to your point, don't dismiss your woundedness. Embrace it. Right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
What's your personal message? What would you like to leave us with? And again, please let folks know how they can work with you.
Yes, yes. I think my personal message is just to trust the journey. Trust the journey. Whatever you experience, the ugly, the dark, the beauty, the light, all of it is intentional, all of it's purposeful, and all of it takes you to who you are to become. And don't discount any experience, and don't judge any experience. And I think that's my message. For anyone who's interested in working with me personally, you're able to contact me through my website at www.empoweredlivingcoaching.com. Again, www.empoweredlivingcoaching.com. Thank you, Dr. Pat.
Thank you. And I want to say this to all of you. We're talking about some people that have written best-selling books, but I want to share something, and I've shared this with Dr. A. Right next to you, perhaps, or someone you know is one of your greatest fans. There's someone there. There's someone very close to you. And sometimes we just have to open our eyes a little wider. Every day, Dr. A, that I wake up and I feel throwing in the towel, whatever the language is, I'm going to share this with the audience because this is important. You don't need to know Deepak Chopra, or you don't need to even know, you don't need to know us. But I'm telling you, it's the small actions. This card, I get a card every year from Susie Hutchinson. Susie Hutchins. Susie is a 20-year listener. Every year I get a card. And every year she sends me $20 in support of the network. Now, why do I do that? Out of everything I got around here, why is Susie's card here? For the same reason Dr. A is surrounding herself with reminders. Because Dr. A, you said it before. We have to remember, don't we? And you have shared with us today a lot to remember as we go back and listen to this. What we walk away from is a memory of you from this show, of someone who understands the pain and the depth of it. So many places in life, and yet here you are. Now you're in service of countless people, and you're not done. Thank you for sharing this today.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Pat.
Thank you of helping us remember that we have to remember. And thank you, Susie. Thank you. Thanks to all of you. You're the best audience in the world. You're amazing. And we've got lots more to come from the Empowered Living Zone. We'll see you next time.
Thank you for tuning in to the Empowered Living Zone show with me, Dr. A, to create the life you crave. Tune in on the first and third Tuesdays at noon Pacific time on transformationtalkradio.com and get ready for another show. Say yes to creating positive and empowering change in your life and move beyond life's challenging terrain into the zone of success. Be ignited by spirit, fueled by purpose, and guided by vision in the Empowered Living Zone. For more information on how to do deep transformational work with me and to create the life you crave, visit empoweredlivingcoaching.com. That's empoweredlivingcoaching.com. See you next time.